Hello, I am Palmer Smitherman, and we are continuing with the study of the Book of Malachi. This is session number 12, and we are beginning to look at section 3 for the first time in this session. Now, from the previous session, we learned that the priests may have been breaking the third commandment by speaking wickedly of God in section 2. They were making the name of God Shav. We also learned that the Gentiles were beginning to worship the God of Israel in Malachi's day, and that not only was the prophecy that we saw in section 2, but we know that historically in the book of Esther, which was perhaps 50 years or so before Malachi or less, that she stated that many Gentiles were actually coming to faith in the God of Israel. And these Gentiles were, in my opinion, making offerings through the covenant of faith. I don't believe that they were making acceptable offerings through the temple sacrifices. I think it was through their faith in the living God. And also, I believe that this was the beginning of the preparation of righteous Gentiles being scattered throughout the world to prepare the way for the coming of the gospel and for the Apostle Paul. Now in this section, we're going to look at section 3, and we are going to discover that section 3 is a very unique, complex, and intricate structure, and it's different than the other sections from a structural standpoint. The overall structure of section 3 is a threefold chiasm, and this is different than what we saw in the other sections. And the focus is on giving glory to the name of God. So you'll notice at the top of this branch of the menorah, there's glory, or kavod, and this is focused on the name of God getting glory. Now in section 1, you may remember that the focus was on God's love, ahav. And so at the top of the first branch of the menorah, you will see love, or ahav. For section 2, there were two important key words. The focus was on making God's name great and fearing God's name. Both of those are important key words of the Tov. I selected Yareh, which is to fear God's name, to place at the top of this branch of the menorah in section 2 because it comes at the end of that particular section. But both Gadol and Yareh, great and fear, are important here. And so here now we have moved on to talking about giving God's name glory. Now let's review some of my structural terminology before we get into the discussion of this section. You'll remember that when I use the term section, this is the largest component of the book of Malachi. And there are 7 major sections. There's also a much smaller appendix at the end, and then there's a one-sentence introduction at the beginning. But there are 7 major sections that are a little smaller than the size of a chapter. Now, this is true also for other books of the Bible. This size of structure, if you will, an intermediate structure, is throughout the Bible, and usually it's on the size of a chapter. Maybe it's a couple chapters, maybe it's less than a chapter, but a section in the Bible is approximately the size of the sections that you see in Malachi in many of the books. Now the sections are divided into what I call parts, and these are components of the sections. You remember that in section 1, there were 5 parts, and these 5 parts were divided into a chiastic structure. In section 2, there were 7 parts, also which were divided into a chiastic structure. And here now we have 3 parts that make up section 3. Now, we haven't spoken about it much, but the parts themselves can be divided into what I call subunits. And so sometimes the parts have pieces that add up to make them into a single unit. And at this level, you begin to get into the structure of the poetry, and you begin to also look at what I call the conceptual structure. And this is not poetry per se, but this is that there are certain ideas that connect together, and the way that these ideas connect together, they form this subunit that then is somehow both separate from the other subunits of the part and yet connects with the other subunits of the part. Now, these divisions are somewhat subjective. And so if you ask, biblical scholars, they will give you different opinions as to where the sections, the parts, or the subunits are to be broken depending on the text. So to some extent, this is my opinion. However, there are rules for how you divide these texts into parts. So for example, one of them is you look for the terminal oral markers. Amar Yahweh Sevaot, which is one of the major terminal markers in Malachi. So let's take a look at the structure of section 3. I call it a 3-part antithetical chiasm. This is my interpretation. So part 1 is a commandment, and it's to give glory to the name of God. And then when you reflect across the center of the chiasm and you come to part 3, what you see is that he complains that the priests have corrupted the covenant. So in other words, they're doing everything but giving glory to the name of God. So that's why I say part 1 is antithetical to part 3. So part 1 is actually the solution to the problem, whereas part 3, we have to wait till part 3 to find out what the actual problem is. This is a little different than the way we think with our Greek mindset. Now, in the very center, in part 2, he gives an example of the righteous priests of old, Levi of old. And this then shows them, how is it that I intend for someone to give glory to my name? And so this is the center of the chiasm, and it's really focused on this is what you're supposed to be like. So let's talk a little bit about how section 2 and section 3 relate. There are some academic scholars who believe that section 2 and section 3 are actually the same section and they should not be divided. However, there are some arguments against that. For example, if they were one section, it would be a tremendously large section compared to the other sections in Malachi. Now, normally the reason that they'll give for this is that in section 3, you don't have the back and forth exchange between God and the priests. However, what I argue is that Malachi does not stick to a particular formula. He's not coming from a Greek mindset. And so in this particular case, no backtalk is permitted from the priests. And so Malachi is flexible, or God is flexible in terms of how he operates within each of these sections. So if you look at section 2, what we initially said was, it is this lovely sevenfold chiasm. And that is the primary structure for that section. But when you look at one section of biblical text, frequently it's like a diamond. You can turn it a different way and you will see, sometimes you will see a secondary structure or a different facet of the diamond if you just look at it a little differently. And so I'm going to show you on the slide. If you look on the left-hand side, section 2 can be considered as two concepts in parallel. The first is that he complains that the priests are despising his name, but then he ends that little part with, but my name should be made great. And then he has another little part of section 2 that says, you're profaning my name, and then in the end, my name should be feared. Now, there are differences between these two parts of this secondary structure. One is that the despise and great section, that's really 4 subunits. It's pretty big. And then the profane and the fear section, that's only 2 subunits. And so it's half the size. It's pretty small. The despise and the great, they have to do with the daily sacrifices, the required sacrifices of the temple. However, the profane and fear, he specifically says, he refers to vows in that section. And so that's more of an implication that he's speaking of voluntary offerings. So we would have, so the despise and great would refer to the requirements, and the profane and fear would require to the voluntary. Now, and so the description of exactly what he's talking about is kind of in the middle in each of these. But now if you look to the far right, I have the overall structure for section 3. So in terms of how they're to treat his name, giving glory to his name, it doesn't come at the end, it comes first. And what he puts last is violating the Torah or not teaching the Torah, one of the two. And this then is very different than a discussion of sacrifices. And then in the middle, he has this statement that this example of the righteous priest, which is something you don't do in section 2. So this is my opinion and the opinion of Dorsey, that section 3 is truly an independent section. However, I particularly think that the secondary structure in section 2 is interesting. And when you kind of look at it this way, you can see section 3 is different. Now let's take a look at part 1 of section 3, and we're going to look at the internal structure. We've never looked at the internal structure of a part before. This baby is a 4-part synonymous chiasm, and so it has a double center, which implies that the outer edges of the chiasm are probably the position of prominence. So in part A, we have the commandment to give God's name glory. And then when you reflect around the center of the chiasm of part 1, you're going to see that he says in A prime, I sent this commandment to you. So these two are in synonymous parallel. Likewise, in the center, we have curses that are in synonymous parallel. So B is what I call the blessing curses, actually is curses on the blessing of the priests, and B prime is the dung curses. These are the curses that have to do with dung. So let's take a close look at A and A prime and see how the structure correlates. So what we see to start with is that the first lines of A and A prime are very similar. So in the first line of A, he says, now you priests, this commandment is for you. So, and then in A prime, he says, and you shall know that I have sent this commandment to you. So immediately you're hearing in both lines, you, and commandment. And so there's obviously a connection between these two. He's emphasizing, I'm speaking to you, the priest. He's really getting their attention and sending them a commandment. And then there's this terminal oral marker again that we learned about in section 2. And this is very good for delineating the end of the subunit. And this is Amar Yahweh Sevaot, says Yahweh of armies. And so we see this in both at the end of A and at the end of A prime. So what's really interesting though is what's in the middle in each one, because what's in the middle is different, and what's in the middle is connected to each other. So let's look at what's in the middle of A. what we see is, it is, if you will not listen and if you will not take it to heart, to give glory to my name. So this forms a very lovely little chiastic structure in the center of A. And so we have give glory to my name then is connected to the commandment. So we learn then structurally that those two are the same, the commandments to give glory. That's what he's talking about. And then he says, the warning, if you will not listen and if you will not take it to heart. Well, let's find out what that's connected with in part A prime. Well, what we see is in the center of A prime, it's now that my commandment may be with Levi. Now remember, there's a lot of text in between these two sections. So you don't read it through the Bible this way. But that's the reason why they're to listen and to take it to heart. Because the commandment needs to continue. So the structure connects the directive to listen and take it to heart with so that my covenant may remain with you. Now let's take a look at the curses. So we see here that we have in subunit B that there are 3 lines that are very similar and 1 line that is different. Then I will send the curse on you, and I will curse your blessings. Indeed, I have cursed them already, because you do not take it to heart. Now, from a poetic standpoint, this would be a double parallel in the sense that you would say, well, the first 2 lines are in parallel, and then the 3rd and 4th line are in parallel. But I'm looking at it more from a conceptual standpoint. And also notice that the type of parallel is different. Actually, the first 3 lines are in synonymous parallel, and the 4th line is different because it's in synthetic parallel. And the 4th line is what I call the primary line. The first 3 lines all combine together to support the concept that comes at the end. I would call this perhaps a tetrastitch, which is 4 lines of poetry, and in this particular 4 lines of poetry, you have these 3 lines that are really supporting this 4th primary line, which is the one that grabs your attention. Now, in our culture, we use this kind of technique. It's a parallel structural technique to grab attention. So if you see duck, 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 goose, then you want to pay attention to the goose because she's different. So forgive the analogy, but in our culture, there's a nursery story of the 3 little pigs, and we use this same type of poetic technique. The wolf huffed and puffed, and he blew down the first little pig's house. The wolf huffed and puffed, and he blew down the second little pig's house. The wolf huffed and puffed, but he couldn't blow down the 3rd little pig's house. So that immediately, because it breaks the parallelism, and it doesn't have a parallel of another line that's joined to it of its own. It doesn't have a mate. That immediately draws our attention. And that's what Malachi is doing. So let's look at its subunit B prime. What does it look like? What we see is that it is a beautiful mirror image of subunit B. So look at this. Now we have 4 lines, but the last 3 lines now are all in synonymous parallel. And I will spread dung on your faces, even the dung of your feasts, and you'll be taken away with it, meaning the dung. So these then are in synthetic parallel with the very first line, not with the last line, because I will rebuke your offspring. So what that does then is it puts the first 3 lines and the last 3 lines together. And then it takes the 2 primary lines of each tetrastitch and welds them together into the center of this structure. And so what he does in the first primary line is he explains the reason, and then he explains in the second primary line, he emphasizes, now you're going to get rebuked. So we have reason and then we have curse. And we're going to see that this is exactly reflected in part 3 the center of part 3, just like we see it here in the very center of part 1. So let's take a look at part 3. Part 3, as you remember, is the mate to part 1. It's reflected around the center of the chiasm of section 3. And it, again, is, in my opinion, a 4-part chiasm with a double center. And I had to look at it for a while to see it. So in subunit A, it's departed from the way, stumbled at the law. In subunit A prime, it's not kept the way and been partial in the law. And then we have B and B prime, and just like the center of what we see of subunits B and B prime in part 1, we have a reason and we have a curse. And so let's get into part 3 and look at the detail. So the first thing that we see here is subunit A, but you have departed from the way and you've caused many to stumble in the law. Then we see what's reflected around the center is subunit A prime, according as you have not kept my ways, but have been partial in the law. So these two, it doesn't get any better for a synonymous parallel. This is just right on the money. Now let's bring in the center and find out what's in the center. You have corrupted the covenant of Levi, says Yahweh of armies. So this is our reason, and it's the summary statement for what they have done. Therefore, I have made you contemptible and wicked before all the people. And here's our curse. So this then is reflecting exactly what we see in the center of part 1. Now, an interesting thing about this is, in part B, the first line has 3 words, the second line has 3 words. In subunit B prime, the first line has 4 words, the second line has 4 words. This gives you a total of 14 words, which is 2 times 7, 7 being the number of completion, 2 being the number of contention, especially when Yahweh is dealing with mankind. And so this shows that he has an issue with them. So parts 1 and 3 map together. Part 1, subunits A and A prime, are the command to give God's name glory. Part 3, subunits A and A prime, state that the priests have been disobedient. And so it's antithetical, one for one. But the center of part 1, subunits B and B prime, state that because you haven't taken it to heart, the reason, you're going to get cursed. And the very center of part 3 has basically the same structure. Because you've corrupted the covenant, then you're going to get cursed. So the centers actually are in synonymous parallel. So let's take a look at this curse a little more closely, and we're going to see something really interesting about this curse. The curse that's in part 1 says, I will rebuke your offspring, and I will spread dung on your faces, even the dung of your feasts. So this is talking about when they slaughter their offerings before God on Yom Kippur or on any of the other high holidays, and they take the offal away, that He's going to take that and smear that on their face. This is really serious. And you will be taken away with it. And you will know that I have sent this commandment to you, that my commandment may be with Levi. So when I read this, it made me think of another passage that sounds very similar. Now it's true, this is during the time before Yeshua came. But look at the words of Yeshua to the church of Thyatira. So in this case, they had a woman who was called Jezebel, who was what the word says, beguiling my servants to commit sexual immorality and eat things sacrificed to idols. Just like the wicked priest of Malachi's day, she was leading people astray. Yeshua said to her, now remember this is after the cross, I will throw her, Jezebel, into a sick bed, and those who commit adultery into tribulation, except they repent of their deeds. I will kill her children with death, and all the assemblies will know that I am he who searches the minds and hearts, and I will give to each one of you according to your deeds. So let's now compare the priests, the message to the priest, and the message to Jezebel. So the message to the priest was, who were teaching the people inappropriately, that they were causing people to stumble in the commandments of God. Jezebel was causing people to commit idolatry and immorality, sexual immorality, and both of them because they were giving the wrong teaching. They weren't teaching what God really wanted. The priests were to be carried away. Jezebel was to be made sick. The priests were to have dung spread on their faces, and her followers were to be oppressed. The seed of the priest, either their offspring or the people that followed them, were to be corrupted, and Jezebel's children were to be killed, perhaps those who followed her teaching. And then you will know that I have sent this commandment, or all the assemblies will know that I am the one that searches the minds and the hearts. This is not a difference between law and grace. This is the same God dealing with the same problem. So the important thing is in our assemblies that we preach the Torah and that we don't tickle people's ears. The important thing is that we always proclaim Yeshua as Lord and not just as our Savior. So the message to Thyatira and the priest was very similar. Parts 1 and 3 of section 3 are the solution and problem respectively, and parts 1 and 3 are both fourfold chiasms. Thank you very much for listening, and shalom.
BibleInteract, uncovering the mysteries of the kingdom of God. At BibleInteract.tv, you will penetrate the scriptures of the Bible. At our store, you're just one click away from owning your favorite books, DVDs, or study guides. Earn a degree from our university and watch hundreds of video presentations from biblical scholars, archaeologists, and theologians. By subscribing to BibleInteract, you'll find all the resources you'll need, so why not subscribe today? Go to www.BibleInteract.tv. You'll be glad you did. Interested in studying more about the temple, the Messiah, or what God's plan is for our future? No problem. We've got you covered. With more than 200 DVDs, books, and workbooks, you'll find the answers you've been searching for. BibleInteract, uncovering the mysteries of the kingdom of God.